Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation. Just me and two of my closest friends, camping deep in the forest, far away from the chaos of the city. I don't know why we chose that forest, why we didn't listen to the rumors. Locals talked about strange sightings, unsettling disappearances, but we laughed it off. Cryptids, skinwalkers, all that supernatural nonsense. It was just stories, right? That's what we thought. Now, I wish we hadn't been so naive. We arrived in the late afternoon, sunlight casting a golden hue through the towering trees. The air smelled fresh, pure, untouched by civilization. A small clearing next to a creek seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the babbling water. Too quiet, in retrospect. After pitching the tents and gathering wood for the fire, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest quickly turned dark. It felt like the trees themselves closed in around us, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers over our camp. But I brushed off the creeping unease. We were safe. We had each other, a fire, and the stars above. We sat around the fire telling jokes and sharing stories, the flames flickering in the cool night air. But after a while the conversation lulled, and we all noticed it at once, the strange silence. The crickets had stopped chirping, the wind had died down, even the creek seemed to have stilled. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Did you guys hear that?" Dan, my friend, broke the silence. We listened. At first nothing. Then it came. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper from the darkness. It was too soft to make out, like a voice carried on the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It sounded wrong, like someone mimicking human speech but just missing the mark. We laughed it off, trying to ignore the chill creeping up our spines, assuming it was just the trees or our imaginations playing tricks. But it wasn't. The whispers continued just on the edge of our hearing, circling the camp. I could see it in the others' faces. Something wasn't right. We tried to distract ourselves, to talk louder, but the fire didn't feel warm anymore. It felt like something cold and unseen was pressing against us, waiting. Around midnight, Dan stood up abruptly, his eyes wide, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "I saw something," he muttered. "Something watching us." "Quit messing around," I said, though I could feel the tightness in my throat. But Dan wasn't laughing. He pointed toward the trees, his hand shaking. There was something, standing between the trees, looking at us. We all stared into the darkness, straining our eyes. The firelight barely reached the edge of the trees, leaving the forest in pitch blackness. My heart was pounding. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, but I didn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something tall, unnaturally tall, slipped between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be human. I barely caught a glimpse. Long limbs, pale skin, moving on all fours like a distorted version of a person. "We need to go," Sarah, my other friend, whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave now." But leaving wasn't an option. The forest was too dark, and we had no idea what was out there. So we stayed by the fire, huddled close, trying to convince ourselves that it was just a deer or some wild animal. But deep down, we knew. This was no animal. As the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, closer. They circled us, sometimes sounding like laughter, other times like someone calling our names. But we never saw who or what was making the sounds. Every now and then we'd catch glimpses of it, something slinking between the trees, just out of reach, always watching. It seemed to enjoy toying with us, staying hidden just long enough to keep us terrified. The worst part was when the footprints started. At first we didn't notice, but as dawn began to creep closer, Sarah gasped. There, in the dirt around our camp, were footprints. Large, clawed, but not quite animal. And the worst part? There were too many of them, coming from every direction, circling, closing in on us. The panic set in. "We have to go," Dan yelled. "I don't care if it's dark. We have to leave." We gathered our things in a rush, leaving half of it behind, and bolted for the path we came in on. But the path was different. It was like the forest had shifted, the trees standing closer, the underbrush thicker. And then came the sound. A howl, low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of something crashing through the trees. Something big. We ran, but no matter how fast we moved, it felt like we were being herded, pushed deeper into the forest. The thing, whatever it was, kept pace with us, its heavy footsteps just behind the trees. Occasionally I'd see those glowing red eyes in the distance, staring at us with a malevolent intelligence, watching us panic. And then Sarah screamed. I turned just in time to see her vanish. One moment she was there, running beside me. The next, she was gone, pulled into the darkness. I heard her scream echo through the trees, but it was cut short, as if something had muffled her, smothered her sound. Dan and I ran faster, but the forest seemed endless. The trail was gone, the landmarks unfamiliar. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I could swear I heard Sarah's voice among them, calling my name, but twisted, wrong. It wasn't her. By some miracle, we stumbled back into the clearing where the car was parked. Dan scrambled for the keys, hands shaking, while I kept my eyes on the tree line. I could feel it, whatever was hunting us, just beyond the shadows, watching, waiting. Finally, the engine roared to life and we sped down the dirt road, the forest disappearing behind us. The feeling of relief was short-lived, though. I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent. Even over the roar of the engine, they were following us, carrying on the wind. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then we didn't speak. What could we say? Sarah was gone, lost to whatever was out there. We couldn't explain it, and no one would believe us if we tried. That was 3 days ago. Dan hasn't spoken since, barely eats, barely sleeps. I can't stop hearing those whispers. No matter where I go, no matter how loud I play the TV or the radio, they're always there, just on the edge of my hearing. And sometimes at night I catch a glimpse of something tall, something wrong, standing just outside my window. The 5 of us thought it would be an unforgettable weekend, a much-needed break from work, stress, and the endless grind. Me, Nate, Emily, Chris, and Sophie had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We'd found an isolated spot deep in Green Ridge Forest, a place so remote it wasn't even on most maps. No cell service, no crowds, just miles of dense trees and untouched wilderness. Perfect, right? By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows through the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the only sounds the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like we were the only people in the world. That first night, we settled in quickly, tents pitched, a fire roaring, and beers cracked open. Nate told his usual dumb jokes. Chris tried to scare us with a story about some local legend, which I ignored. And Sophie snapped pictures for her Instagram, trying to capture the perfect camping aesthetic. We were relaxed, happy. That was until we heard the scream. It was distant, faint enough that we weren't sure we heard it at all at first. But then it came again, unmistakable. A shrill, blood-curdling scream far off in the woods. We all froze, staring at each other in shock. What the hell was that? Sophie whispered, her face pale. Probably just some animal, Nate said, though his voice wavered. You know, like a mountain lion or something. They can sound like a woman screaming. Emily nodded, though she looked uneasy. "Yeah, that's probably it. Animals." But something about the scream felt wrong. It wasn't just an animal call. It sounded too human, too desperate. Chris stood up, his expression grim. "I think we should check it out. What if someone's hurt?" "Out here?" I asked. "There's no one for miles." "Maybe a lost hiker," he insisted. "We can't just ignore it." Against my better judgment, we grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods, leaving the safety of the campfire behind. The further we walked, the quieter the night became. No more wind, no more animals, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on dead leaves. The scream didn't come again, but we pressed on deeper into the forest. The trees were thick, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow seemed to move just out of sight. "Do you see that?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice shaking. We all stopped, peering into the darkness where she was pointing. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, something glinted. Two small, reflective eyes low to the ground, staring at us. My breath caught in my throat. "An animal?" I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Chris took a step forward, shining his light toward the eyes. As the beam hit them, they vanished, gone, as if whatever had been watching us had melted into the darkness. "Let's go back," Sophie said, her voice tight with fear. "This doesn't feel right." I was about to agree when the scream came again, louder this time, closer. It echoed through the trees, sending a cold shiver down my spine. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I realized we had wandered too far from camp. The fire was just a memory behind us, and all around, the woods felt wrong, like they were closing in. "We need to go," I said firmly, gripping my flashlight tighter. Chris opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, something moved in the darkness, fast, a blur of motion darting between the trees. We all turned our flashlights toward it, but whatever it was gone before the light could catch it. "Did you see that?" Nate hissed, his voice low. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. There was something out there, watching us, hunting us. Without another word, we turned and hurried back the way we came, trying to retrace our steps to camp. But the deeper we walked, the more I realized we were lost. The woods all looked the same in the dark, every tree a twin of the last, every path leading nowhere. "We should have marked the trail," Emily muttered, her voice cracking. "We should have—" She was cut off by another sound, a low, guttural growl, so close it made my blood turn to ice. We all froze, flashlights whipping around wildly, but there was nothing, just trees, just shadows. Then the eyes appeared again. This time, they weren't low to the ground. They were higher, at the level of a human's eyes. Dozens of them, surrounding us in a wide circle. Reflective, unblinking eyes watching from the darkness. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared like they were waiting for something. "We need to run," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But before we could move, the eyes shifted, darting closer, closing the circle around us. My breath hitched as I realized what we were dealing with. These weren't animals. They weren't human. One of the figures stepped forward into the light, its form barely recognizable, twisted, deformed. It looked like a man, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way. Its face was hollow, the skin pulled too tight over its skull, its mouth hanging open in a twisted grin that exposed far too many teeth. The creature took another step forward, and then another until it was almost close enough to touch. I couldn't move. None of us could. It was like we were frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then the thing spoke. Its voice was low and raspy, like it hadn't used its vocal cords in years. "You don't belong here." And with that, the woods erupted into chaos. The creatures rushed us, moving faster than any human could. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I fell to the ground. Around me, my friends were screaming, but it was all a blur. A nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was those eyes, those horrible glowing eyes, and that twisted smile bearing down on me. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was filtering through the trees, casting everything in a warm, golden light. It almost felt like a dream, until I looked around and realized I was alone. The camp was gone. My friends were gone. No tents, no backpacks, nothing but me, lying in the dirt. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints, no blood, just nothing. But I knew what I had seen, what we had all seen. And now every time I close my eyes, I see them, those eyes in the woods, watching, waiting. I never found my friends, and I'll never go back to that forest. But sometimes at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the scream. The hike into the backcountry was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from the relentless grind of city life. I needed to get away, to clear my head, so I packed my gear and headed out to one of the most isolated parts of the national park, miles from the nearest trailhead where you could walk all day and never see another person. It was perfect. The first day went smoothly. The trail was quiet, only the occasional bird call or distant rustle of animals in the brush. I set up camp just before sunset, in a small clearing nestled among towering pines. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. The fire I built crackled and popped, filling the air with the comforting smell of wood smoke. For a while, I just sat there, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. The forest at night is a strange place, though. As darkness swallowed the landscape, the silence grew deeper, too deep. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the faint sound of the wind stirring the branches overhead. I tried not to think too much of it. Wilderness could be eerie, especially if you weren't used to it. I figured the animals had quieted down because they sensed a predator in the area, maybe a mountain lion or a bear. But still, the quiet pressed down on me in a way that was hard to ignore. That's when I heard the first noise. It started as a low, almost imperceptible hum, like distant machinery, growing louder and sharper by the second. I turned, scanning the darkened tree line, expecting to see headlights or a plane passing overhead. But there was nothing. And then, as quickly as it had come, the noise stopped. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. I tossed another log onto the fire and took a deep breath, watching the embers glow as the flames caught. I was alone. No one else was out here, I reminded myself. No one but me. But later that night, as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I felt it again. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I rolled over, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me, listening. The fire outside was dying, the faint crackle of embers barely audible through the thin tent walls. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, too quiet. And then there was the sound of footsteps. Not the padded steps of an animal, but the deliberate, slow crunch of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened. I held my breath, straining to listen, hoping it was just a deer passing through. But the footsteps didn't sound like a deer. They sounded too heavy, too deliberate. I sat up in the tent, my breath coming shallow, eyes wide as I peered out through the small mesh window. The clearing was empty. The fire was just a smoldering pile of ash now, casting faint, flickering shadows. I could see the dark silhouettes of the trees surrounding me, standing like silent sentinels. But no people, no animals. I waited, heart thudding in my chest, listening as the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. I must have imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of my own movements rustling the fabric of the tent. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but as I listened closer, I could make it out. A voice, low and raspy, barely more than a breath. Come out. Every muscle in my body froze. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I'd misheard. But then it came again, louder this time. Come out. Into the woods. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced through every horror story, every urban legend I'd ever heard about people disappearing in the woods. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stay put, to lock myself in the tent and wait for morning. But something primal, something deeper, wanted me to run. The voice came again, closer now. Come into the woods. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I had to know what was out there. My fingers fumbled with the zipper of the tent, and as quietly as I could, I pulled it open just enough to shine the light outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, just the dark shapes of trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. No people, no animals, no tracks in the dirt. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see someone lurking there, watching me. But there was nothing. The voice was gone. The footsteps were gone. But that feeling, that crawling, insidious sensation of being watched, lingered. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, wide awake, staring at the roof of the tent, my heart still racing. Sleep wasn't going to come easily that night. Hours passed. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the tent. I bolted upright, my hand gripping the flashlight again. My breath came in shallow gasps as the scratching continued, circling the tent slowly, methodically. Whatever was out there, it was close. So close I could hear it breathing, slow and steady. Scratch, scratch. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the flashlight on and unzipped the tent in one swift motion, shining the beam into the darkness. Again, nothing. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, too tall to be human, its limbs impossibly long and thin. It stood there, completely still, its head cocked to one side, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I stumbled backward, falling out of the tent, scrambling to get away. But the figure didn't move. It just watched, unblinking, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I fumbled for my backpack, grabbing the first thing I could find, my hatchet, and held it out in front of me, heart pounding in my throat. But still, the thing didn't move. And then, it spoke. In that same raspy, whispering voice, "Come into the woods." I didn't think, I just ran. I don't remember much of the sprint through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots tangling at my feet, but I ran until my legs gave out, until the darkness of the trees swallowed me whole. Somehow I made it to a dirt road. A park ranger found me there the next morning, half delirious with exhaustion, clutching the hatchet like a lifeline. I tried to explain what had happened, about the voice, about the figure in the woods, but the ranger just shook his head. "You're not the first," he said quietly, eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "And you won't be the last. They're always watching out there." I never went back to those woods, but sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I still hear that whisper, "Come into the woods." I should have known better than to take the midnight shift. Every ranger knows that Hollow Grove isn't a place you want to be alone after dark. But duty calls, and I was the newest ranger in the area, so I didn't really have a choice. Besides, I'd always thought the stories were just that, stories. Tales to scare the city folk and keep kids from wandering too deep into the forest. But on this particular night, I realized just how wrong I was. It was early October, and the nights had started to carry that deep chill that sinks into your bones. The wind was blowing harder than usual, and the trees seemed to whisper secrets to each other as they swayed. I was out checking the perimeter when I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a coyote, maybe even a bear. But it didn't sound right. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. With my flashlight in hand, I pushed deeper into the forest, feeling the darkness press in around me. My breath formed little puffs of mist in the frigid air, and every step I took seemed to echo louder than the last. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little moonlight there was. I felt like I was walking into the very belly of the beast. Then, out of nowhere, the forest fell silent. Not a single cricket, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive weight of the quiet. I stopped, gripping my flashlight tightly, the beam shaking as I swept it over the trees. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Bright, reflective eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to be a coyote, too close together to be a deer, and they didn't blink. They just watched, unblinking, as if sizing me up. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I should have turned back then, but something compelled me to keep going, as if an invisible thread was pulling me forward. The eyes disappeared, but I could hear something moving just out of sight, keeping pace with me. I sped up, trying to shake the feeling that I was being hunted, but no matter how fast I walked, the footsteps stayed with me. Suddenly, the trail forked. I'd walked this path 100 times, but I had never seen it split like that before. One path led back toward the ranger station. The other veered off into a part of the forest that wasn't on any map. I hesitated, feeling a strange pull toward the unmarked path. It was like the forest itself was drawing me in, and despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I took a step toward the darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and a foul stench filled the air, like rotting meat mixed with wet earth. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the twisted trees that now seemed to loom over me like silent sentinels. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavier now and getting closer. I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight landing on something that stopped me cold. Standing there just beyond the reach of the light was a figure. Tall, emaciated, with limbs too long and a face that was more beast than human. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and flesh, like it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. I knew in that moment that I was looking at a skinwalker, a creature I had always dismissed as a myth, a campfire tale, but it was real, and it was staring right at me. I froze, barely daring to breathe. It took a step forward, and then another, its body moving in unnatural, jerky motions. The stench grew stronger, and I could see its mouth opening, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. I took a step back, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the skinwalker let out an ear-piercing screech and bolted off into the trees faster than any creature I'd ever seen. I stood there, rooted to the spot, wondering if it was gone for good. But the forest didn't relax. The silence was back, heavy and thick, pressing down on me. I forced myself to turn around only to find the path had changed again. The trail that had led me into the woods was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of twisted trees. Panic surged through me. I spun around, hoping to catch sight of something familiar, but the forest had swallowed me whole. There was no way out. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, soft and distant, calling my name. Ranger Thomas. It sounded almost familiar, like someone I'd known long ago. I knew I should ignore it, but the way she said my name, so comforting, so warm, I found myself walking toward the sound, deeper into the dark. The voice led me to a small clearing. In the middle of it was a cabin, old and dilapidated, with the door hanging off its hinges. I knew this place shouldn't exist. I'd never seen a cabin here before, and I knew the forest well, but there it was, standing in front of me like it had been waiting. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me first: decay, mold, and something else, something metallic. The interior was filled with strange markings on the walls, symbols I didn't recognize but that made my skin crawl. And there, in the center of the room, was a mirror. It was cracked, the shards reflecting my face back at me in fragments. But then I noticed something horrifying. My reflection. It wasn't moving like I was. The realization washed over me like ice. The reflection grinned, an unnatural, twisted smile that didn't belong on my face. It mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I understood. It was taunting me, showing me what I would become. A prisoner of this place, just like all the others who had heard the forest's call. I stumbled backward, the room spinning around me. When I finally found the strength to run, I burst out of the cabin and into the forest, desperate to escape. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at me, trying to hold me back. I didn't stop running until I saw the faint lights of the ranger station. But when I reached the station, something was off. The building looked wrong, like it had aged decades in the few hours I'd been gone. I stepped inside, and the air was thick with dust. I checked the clock on the wall and my stomach dropped. It had been 2 days since I'd gone out on patrol. I never did find out what happened in those woods that night. I submitted my resignation the next morning, packed up, and left town. But every now and then, I hear that voice calling me, just outside my window. And sometimes, if I look into the mirror at the wrong moment, I see that grin, and I know I'll never really escape Hollow Grove. The forest doesn't let go, and neither do they. I've always loved the woods. They've been a part of me since I was a kid, hiking with my dad through the forests of northern Michigan. The smell of pine, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the feeling of being utterly alone in the wild. It's where I feel most at peace. That's why I became a park ranger. It seemed like the perfect way to spend my life, surrounded by the nature I loved, helping others enjoy it too. But there's something no one tells you about the deep woods, something they don't put in the brochures or the training manuals. There are places in the forest where things happen, things that don't make sense, things you can't explain, places where the forest is different, darker. And if you're unlucky enough to find one of those places, you don't forget it. I found one of those places. It was late in the season, the tourists had mostly packed up and gone, and I was on a solo patrol near Shadow Lake. The area doesn't see much traffic, too remote, too hard to get to, but it's beautiful, especially in the fall, with the leaves turning orange and red, the lake a perfect mirror of the sky. I'd been patrolling that area for a couple of years by then, knew the trails like the back of my hand, but on this day, I decided to take a route I'd never tried before. There was an old logging road, long abandoned, that cut through the deeper part of the forest. It hadn't been maintained in decades, and I figured it might be good to check it out, see if it needed marking as off-limits. I set off early in the morning, the sun just starting to rise. The woods were quiet, the air crisp with the scent of fall. I followed the main trail for a few miles, then cut off toward the old logging road. It was overgrown as I expected, the path barely visible beneath the layers of fallen leaves and brambles, but I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, the challenge of navigating a place that hadn't been touched by people in years. About an hour in, the woods started to change. The air got colder, and the trees grew thicker, their branches twisted together like they were trying to block out the sky. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the leaves in patches, was now almost completely gone, leaving the forest in an eerie twilight. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. The birds were gone. Up until that point, I'd been hearing the usual forest sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But now, it was silent. Completely silent. Not even the wind was moving through the trees anymore. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the isolation, that I was overthinking it. But then I saw the footprints. They were huge, larger than any bear tracks I'd ever seen. And they weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The prints were deep, and the shape. It wasn't right. They looked almost human, but longer, with claw marks at the toes. I kneeled down to get a better look, my skin prickling with unease. That's when the smell hit me. It was like something rotting, thick, sour, and overpowering. It made me gag, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve just to keep from throwing up. I stood up, heart pounding, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The woods felt wrong. The silence was oppressive, and the air, it was thick, almost heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of forest, dark and still. I should have turned back then. Every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, but I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared. I kept walking, deeper into the woods, following the old logging road as it twisted through the trees. The footprints were still there, leading the same direction I was going. And then, after what felt like hours, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was an old abandoned campsite, tents collapsed and rotting, the fabric torn and weathered, rusted camping gear scattered across the ground, covered in a thick layer of dirt and leaves. But it wasn't the decay that bothered me. It was the fact that it looked like it had been there for years, and no one had reported it. Not once in all my time working this area had I heard of a missing camper or an abandoned site. I walked toward it cautiously. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the edge of the campsite, partially buried in the dirt, was a boot. A human boot. And sticking out of the boot was a bone, white, cracked, and old. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone had died here, but there was no record of it, no reports, nothing. I was about to radio it in when I heard something, a low, guttural sound, like a growl coming from the trees behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, every muscle tensed. At first I didn't see anything, just the trees, silent and still. But then I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows between the trunks. It was tall, taller than any man, and it moved in a way that wasn't natural, jerking, like it didn't quite know how to use its limbs. And then it stepped into the clearing. It was wrong. Its body was elongated, thin, with arms that hung too long, almost reaching the ground. Its skin was pale, gray, stretched tight over its bones. But its face, God, its face. It was like a twisted mockery of a human face with sunken black eyes and a mouth that hung open, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I froze, too terrified to move as it stared at me, its head cocking to the side like it was curious. And then, slowly, it opened its mouth wider and let out a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It was a scream, high-pitched, inhuman, like metal scraping on metal. It pierced the silence, cutting through the air like a knife. I bolted. I don't know how I managed it, but my legs kicked into gear, and I ran faster than I ever have in my life. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blurring past as I sprinted back down the trail. Behind me, I could hear it, crashing through the woods, its footsteps heavy and erratic. I don't remember much about the run back, it's all a blur. But somehow I made it to the ranger station, slammed the door behind me and locked it. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, every inch of me trembling. I never went back to that part of the forest. I filed the report about the abandoned campsite, but I left out the part about the creature. No one would believe me anyway. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there. The woods aren't empty. They're not peaceful, not in the way people think. Something else is in there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for you to stray too far from the path. And if you're unlucky enough to find it, you won't come back, just like those hikers. Camping wasn't my thing, but after weeks of my buddy Rob nagging about this legendary trail out in the middle of the Rockies, I gave in. It was supposed to be one of those real wilderness experiences, far from civilization, where no phone signal could reach and the stars stretched endlessly above your head, That part sounded all right, but everything else? Nah, especially after the stories I'd heard about these woods. Cryptid stories, stuff about skinwalkers and creatures lurking in the trees. Of course, I told myself they were just stories. The drive-in was long, too long. Rob's Jeep rattled over uneven dirt roads, nothing but trees and mountains around us for miles. The moment we lost cell signal, a pit formed in my stomach. But Rob, in his excitement, missed my unease. "Man, this place is going to be epic," he said, grinning as he sped up. "There's a ranger station near the start of the trail. We can check in, grab a map, all that." A small, worn-down wooden structure marked the entrance to the trailhead. A park ranger stepped out as we pulled in. He looked off. His uniform was dirty, his face gaunt, but his eyes, those dark eyes locked on us with unsettling intensity. He barely said a word while Rob chatted, just grunted something about making sure we stay on the trail and get back before dark. I tried to laugh it off, but something in his voice lingered with me. The trail was rugged, leading us deep into the forest. The trees thickened, casting long shadows that stretched over the narrow path. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. We set up camp by a small clearing as dusk crept in. I thought the isolation might ease up on me once the fire was going. It didn't. The fire flickered in the dark, casting long shadows over the trees that seemed to twist and shift when you weren't looking directly at them. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just my nerves. The first night I woke to something outside the tent. At first I thought it was Rob snoring or moving around. But no, this was different. Something was pacing just beyond the firelight, crunching softly through the underbrush. I listened, frozen, as it circled our camp. Slow, deliberate steps. And then silence. I wanted to call out to Rob, but I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, heart pounding, listening to the wind stir the branches. I must have drifted off because when I woke again it was morning. Rob was already up, oblivious, messing around with the campfire. "You hear that last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hear what?" I dropped it. Maybe I was overreacting, but things got worse that afternoon. We hiked further up the trail, deeper into the woods, aiming for a ridge that supposedly had a killer view. The higher we went, the more uneasy I felt. I started noticing things, trees with deep claw marks like something had been sharpening its nails, and strange, twisted piles of bones at the base of several trees. Deer? Maybe. But then we found a pile of feathers, ripped clean off some poor bird arranged in a spiral. Rob, this normal to you?" Rob just shrugged it off, cracking a dumb joke. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. From the corner of my eye, I kept catching glimpses of movement, shadows that shouldn't have been there darting between the trees. Every now and then I'd hear strange, distorted animal sounds, like a coyote, but wrong. It was stretched out, elongated, like it had been played backward. We reached the ridge just before dusk. The view wasn't worth it. A thick fog had rolled in, choking the landscape. No stars, no moon, just darkness. It made everything feel claustrophobic. I wanted to head back to camp, but Rob insisted we stay and watch the sunset, what little there was of it. That's when we saw them, silhouettes moving through the fog. At first I thought it was just hikers, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Jerky, unnatural, their limbs contorting at odd angles. They were too tall, too thin. They didn't walk. They seemed to glide. "Rob, we need to go. Now." He laughed it off, but when the figures stopped all at once and turned toward us, I saw his smile fade. The silence was deafening. We didn't even speak as we grabbed our gear and bolted back down the trail. I swear I could hear footsteps behind us echoing ours, close, too close. We barely made it back to camp before dark. My lungs burned and Rob kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes wide. The fire was out. No smoke, No embers, just cold ash, like it had been dead for hours. We sat there in the dark, too freaked out to talk. Rob kept looking at the woods, and I swore I could see shapes moving between the trees again, just out of sight. Then, the voice came. It was Rob's voice, but it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the trees. "Hey, over here!" it called out, mimicking his tone exactly. But Rob was sitting right next to me, pale as a ghost. We both froze. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Come on, follow me." That's when the smell hit, rotting meat, sour and thick, filling the air. I gagged. Rob stood up, looking around wildly. "Dude, we need to go back to the ranger station." But when we tried to pack, something stepped into the clearing. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Its limbs were too long, its face blank except for dark, hollow eyes. And the smell, it was coming from it. "Stay on the trail," it rasped in that same distorted voice, now impossibly deep. "Stay. On the trail." I didn't think. I just grabbed Rob and ran. The thing followed, its footsteps matching ours, gaining. My heart pounded in my throat, fear overtaking any sense of direction. We ran through the trees, branches whipping at us, the stench growing stronger. And then suddenly the ranger station appeared ahead of us like a beacon of safety. We burst inside, slamming the door behind us, breathing hard. The ranger was there, sitting at his desk, calm, too calm. "We need help," Rob gasped, barely able to speak. "There's something out there." The ranger just looked at us, those same dark eyes as before, but now I realized what was wrong with them. They weren't human. They were empty, lifeless. "You didn't stay on the trail," he said in that same deep voice. And behind him, stepping out of the shadows, were more of those things. Tall, thin figures with twisted limbs and hollow eyes, grinning. The door clicked shut behind us. "We're here to take you back to the woods," the ranger whispered, his voice stretching, breaking. "The rangers will come for you." Then darkness. I had always been fascinated by the idea of disappearing into the wilderness, living off the grid for a few days, alone with my thoughts and the untamed beauty of nature. So, when I heard about the Clearwater Pines, a vast, remote forest deep in the Pacific Northwest, I didn't hesitate to plan a solo trip. It was supposed to be peaceful, rejuvenating, but what I found there was far from it. The forest was legendary among hikers and campers, not for its beauty, though it was stunning, but for the strange stories that surrounded it. Stories about hikers who never returned, about strange lights and sounds in the night. But I didn't believe in those kinds of things. I'm a rational person. I thought the stories were just that, stories. I arrived early in the morning, mist hanging low over the trees. The air was damp, cold, and still. The trailhead was deserted, as I'd expected. This wasn't a place that attracted casual hikers. You had to really want to be out here to make the trip. I slung my pack over my shoulders and set off, following the narrow, overgrown trail that snaked deeper into the woods. The trees here were ancient, tall, thick, and gnarled, their branches intertwined to create a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The deeper I went, the darker it got, despite the fact that the sun was high in the sky. For the first few hours, everything was normal, peaceful even. I could hear the sounds of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. But then, as the afternoon wore on, the forest seemed to change. The sounds of life gradually faded, until there was nothing but silence. And that's when I noticed it. The trees around me had started to look different. They were taller, their trunks twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. The bark was darker, almost black, and there was a strange, oily sheen to it. The branches overhead were so dense now that barely any light filtered through. It felt like I had crossed some invisible threshold into a different part of the forest, a place that didn't welcome visitors. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I'd been hiking all day, and I was tired. Maybe I was just imagining things. I checked my map and compass, orienting myself. According to the map, I should have been near Clearwater Creek by now, where I planned to set up camp, but I hadn't seen any sign of water. Frustrated, I pressed on, hoping the creek would appear soon. But as the minutes dragged into hours, it became clear that something was wrong. The trail had all but disappeared, and I felt like I was walking in circles. Every tree looked the same, twisted, dark, and foreboding. By the time the sun started to set, panic had begun to set in. I was lost, deep in a part of the forest that didn't feel right. I set up camp quickly, deciding that it was better to stop for the night than to wander aimlessly in the dark. I built a small fire, though the wood here seemed damp and reluctant to burn. The flames were weak, casting flickering shadows that only made the forest seem more menacing. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The air grew heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay, a smell I hadn't noticed during the day. I huddled close to the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive darkness that surrounded me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first sound came just after midnight, a faint rustling in the trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tensed, gripping my flashlight, and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. Still, the sound continued, growing louder, closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, from deep within the forest, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I scanned the trees, trying to see something, anything. But the forest remained still, unnervingly quiet. I sat there for what felt like hours, my nerves frayed, waiting for something to happen. But the night stretched on, cold and silent, until exhaustion finally overtook me. I dozed off despite my fear. I woke suddenly, my eyes snapping open to total darkness. The fire had gone out, and the temperature had dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, each exhale a cloud of white mist. My skin prickled with a deep instinctual sense of dread. Then I heard it again, the growl. But this time it was much closer. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and flicked it on. The beam wavered as I shone it into the woods, my heart racing. For a moment I thought I saw something, a figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the trees. But it was gone before I could focus on it, disappearing into the shadows. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. Whatever it was circling me, watching me. I could feel it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I had no idea which direction to run. I was lost, and there was something out there hunting me. I backed toward my tent, trying to think, trying to calm myself. But then, I heard it again. This time, a voice. A whisper, faint but clear, coming from the trees. "Come closer." My blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't a human voice. It was distorted, like it was trying to mimic speech but didn't quite know how. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tense. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Come closer," the voice repeated, this time from a different direction. I spun around, shining the light wildly through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Just darkness. I grabbed my pack and bolted. I didn't care which direction I was going anymore. I just had to get away. I ran through the forest, my flashlight bouncing wildly, branches slashing at my face and arms. The voice followed me, always just behind, whispering, urging me to come closer. I didn't stop until I stumbled out of the trees and onto a dirt road, panting and drenched in sweat. My legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running, desperate to put as much distance between me and whatever was in those woods as possible. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I sped away, not daring to look back. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to Clearwater Pines. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that voice, faint and distant, calling to me. Come closer. I've never been afraid of the woods, not like some people. Growing up in a small town surrounded by thick forests, I spent most of my childhood exploring trails, building forts, even camping alone as a teenager. The sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of owls, the steady hum of insects, always felt like home to me. Until that night. I had decided to head out for a solo camping trip, something I did at least once every summer. A way to clear my head and get away from the constant barrage of screens, work, and noise. I picked a spot deep in the forest, about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road, far from any popular hiking paths. I wanted isolation. I got it. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the clearing, a small, flat area surrounded by towering pine trees. The air smelled fresh, earthy. There was a calmness to the place, a stillness that felt right. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and by the time the sun started to set, I had a fire going strong. I remember thinking how perfect it all was, the quiet, the solitude. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest darkened, that feeling of peace began to slip away. At first, it was just little things. The way the trees seemed to close in around the clearing as the light faded. The way the shadows stretched and twisted in the firelight, making the forest seem more alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, sat by the fire, roasted some marshmallows, listened to the usual night sounds, crickets, wind in the trees, an occasional owl. But then, there was something else, a rustling. At first I thought it was the wind, but this sound was different, more deliberate, like footsteps. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were trees. Still, that sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, continued. It circled the campsite, slow and steady, just beyond the reach of the light. I called out, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a stray hiker who had wandered off course. But no one answered. The footsteps just stopped. I told myself it was an animal, nothing to worry about. I tried to laugh it off, even though every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. I sat back down, poked at the fire, and listened. Everything was silent now, too silent. The usual chorus of nighttime creatures had gone dead quiet. And then I heard it. A voice. At first it was faint. A whisper carried on the wind, so soft I almost didn't catch it. But as it continued, I realized it wasn't just any whisper. It was my name. Josh. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I spun the flashlight around the clearing, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The trees stood still, the shadows thick and unmoving. I felt the air grow colder. The voice came again, this time clearer, more distinct. Josh, over here. It was coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of nausea. There was no way anyone could be out here. I was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd left my truck. But that voice, it sounded familiar. It sounded like my brother. But my brother had been dead for 5 years. I hadn't thought about him in months, maybe even years. His face flashed in my mind, a memory of the last time we'd camped together before the accident. It was a stupid thing, really. He had wandered off the trail while we were hiking, lost his footing, and fell into a ravine. They said he died instantly. I didn't see it happen, but I was there. I found him. His body had been twisted in ways I can't forget, no matter how much I try. But now his voice was calling me from the woods. I stood there, frozen, listening as it called again, more insistent this time. "Josh, come here. I need you." I should have left. I should have run straight to my tent, packed up, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. Something about the voice, his voice, pulled at me. Against my better judgment, I stepped away from the fire, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and moved toward the trees. The moment I crossed into the darkness, the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. The temperature dropped, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled my nose. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and sputtering. The voice came again, closer now, almost like it was right beside me. "I'm here, Josh, just a little further." I pushed deeper into the woods, the light barely cutting through the shadows. My heart raced, and my breath came in short, shallow bursts. Every step felt wrong, but I couldn't stop. My brother's voice kept pulling me forward. I reached a small clearing, the trees thinning out. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, and at the center of it stood a figure. It was him, or it looked like him. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were sunken, dark pits that reflected no light. His body was gaunt, his limbs unnaturally long, and his skin seemed to hang loose on his bones. But it was his face, my brother's face. "Josh," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I need you to come with me." I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. My brother was dead, buried. This thing in front of me, it wasn't him. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it stepped toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. "You left me," it hissed, its voice warping, distorting. "You let me die." I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down from all sides. The thing that looked like my brother screamed, an ear-piercing wail that echoed through the forest, chasing me. My legs burned as I ran, branches slapping my face, the cold air cutting into my lungs. But I didn't stop. When I finally burst back into my campsite, I collapsed near the fire, gasping for breath. The wailing had stopped. The forest was silent again, but I could feel it watching me. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, and waited for the sun to rise. The moment the first light broke through the trees, I packed up and left. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But even now, weeks later, I still hear it sometimes. That voice, my brother's voice, calling from the woods.